picture a Shakespearean actor in your head. Like, really listen to that crisp, refined, proper British accent.
Yeah.
The kind of voice you just expect to hear in, I don't know, a grand English estate with silver tea services and velvet curtains. Now, I need you to completely erase it. Because what if I told you that William Shakespeare sounded a lot more like a modern-day American than a modern British aristocrat?
It just completely shatters the illusion, doesn't it? I mean, we are so conditioned to hear that polished British pronunciation and immediately equate it with antiquity.
Right. It feels like the past.
Exactly. It feels older, like it's the original version.
Like the original factory setting of the English language. Well, today's mission for this deep dive is to explore how basically everything you thought you knew about fancy accents is completely backward. We're pulling from this brilliant article in Psychology Today by Valerie Fridland.
She's a PhD and a linguistics professor, yeah.
Right, and her piece is titled, Why Do Americans and Brits Speak Differently?
Mm.
And we are going to look at how migration, social climbing, and even just outright political rebellion led to this massive transatlantic split in how we speak.
It really is a mind-bending look at history.
Yeah.
Because, by the end of this, the way you hear yourself talk is going to completely change.
Oh, absolutely. So let's start with the biggest shocker from the source material, and it centers entirely around the letter R.
Ah, yes, the notorious R.
In America, most people hit that R really hard. You park the car in the yard.
Right, what linguists actually call rhoticity.
Rhoticity, exactly. And according to this research, that American pronunciation, that hard R, is actually the older, originally more prestigious form.
Yeah, it's wild. If we were to build a time machine and step out into the streets of 16th century London, the English we'd hear would be jarringly familiar to an American ear.
Really? Jarringly familiar.
Oh, without a doubt. The people walking those cobblestone streets pronounced their R's vigorously. Words like heart, girl, and farmer. They were spoken with a fully realized hard R.
Okay, let's unpack this, because my brain is having a hard time visualizing this timeline. You're saying that if I went to the Globe Theater in the late 1500s for opening night of Hamlet,
Yeah.
the actors on stage wouldn't sound like those terribly posh, refined British actors we see in modern film adaptations.
Not at all. They would have sounded remarkably close to an American.
Oh, wow.
The way we perform Shakespeare today, with that highly elevated R-dropping British accent, is basically a modern historical fiction. The original performers were pronouncing their consonants loud and clear.
I love this because it's like looking at a sleek, brand new smartphone and assuming it must be the original model just because it looks fancier and more sophisticated.
Right, exactly.
Meanwhile, the big, clunky, heavy rotary phone is actually the true ancestor. We've just completely misidentified the original model based on our modern aesthetics of what sounds fancy.
That's a great analogy.
But my instinct is always to assume the older country has the older accents. Why did we get this timeline so totally backward?
Well, what's fascinating here is that our modern association between British accents and antiquity is essentially a social illusion.
Huh.
Language doesn't just freeze in place just because a nation has a long history. What we are really looking at is a story of linguistic innovation.
Okay.
The people who stayed in England were the ones who radically changed how they spoke, while the colonists who went to America effectively preserved the older way of speaking.
So if the original model was the hard R, I'm kind of stuck on the physics of this. How does an entire country just collectively decide to stop pronouncing a letter?
It's a good question.
Did the British just wake up one day in the late 17th century and decide the letter R was out of style?
It wasn't a conscious fashion choice. I mean, at least not initially. It was driven by a phenomenon linguists call speed speech. Yeah. Human beings are inherently efficient creatures.
Oh.
Or, to put it less charitably, we look for shortcuts. When we speak quickly, we naturally search for ways to reduce the muscular effort required to produce sounds.
Okay, I get the concept of taking a shortcut, but what is actually happening in the mouth? The source material mentions phonetic environments, but I really need to know why the R was the specific casualty here.
Let's look at the physical mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
Try saying a word where an R is sandwiched between a vowel and the letter S.
Okay.
For example, the old pronunciation of the word arse.
Yeah.
To say that clearly, your tongue has to pull back into the center of your mouth to create the R sound, and then immediately push forward toward your teeth to create the hissing S sound.
Oh, I see.
It's a clunky, demanding sequence of movements if you're trying to speak rapidly.
It is linguistic gymnastics. You're bouncing your tongue back and forth just to get through a single syllable.
You've hit on the exact mechanism there. To make it easier, speakers in the 17th century simply stopped making that backward movement for the R.
They just skipped it entirely.
Exactly. But when you remove a consonant like that, it leaves a gap in the rhythm of the word. To fill that gap, the speaker naturally stretches out the vowel that came right before it.
It's like taking a shortcut across the grass instead of walking the paved path.
Yes.
At first, it's just a few people cutting the corner to save time, and it feels a little rough. But eventually, so many people walk over the grass that you wear a new dirt path, and suddenly, that becomes the official walkway.
That is precisely it. That stretched out vowel filled the space where the R used to be. The clunky phonetic sequence smoothed out, and the shortcut became the norm.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the examples the source material gives for this early wave of shortcuts are absolutely hilarious.
They really are.
When the British started taking this dirt path, the word arse stretched out and became ass. The word curse dropped the R, stretched the vowel, and became cuss, and burst became bust.
And consider the timeline of when this was happening. The early American colonists were already over in the New World when this first, very specific wave of R dropping emerged.
Right, they were already across the ocean.
But they were still in contact with the motherland. Ships were going back and forth, bringing news, goods, and, this new, snappy, fast speech trend.
So the colonists heard it and thought, oh, that is way easier to say.
Exactly.
They adopted ass, cuss, and bust and permanently wired them into the American vocabulary.
They adopted that first wave, yeah, but they missed the much larger shift that followed.
What happened next?
Back in England, this habit of dropping the R began to spread. It stopped being limited to just that tricky R before an S environment. Over the next century, British speakers started dropping the R almost any time it came after a vowel.
Oh, wow.
So car became ka, never became neva.
I see the disconnect now. By the time that massive second wave of R dropping took over London, the American colonists were a world away.
Right, they were geographically isolated.
They kept the first wave of shortcuts, which is why we still say cuss, but they completely missed the memo that London had changed the rules for all the other R's. It's an incredible irony.
That really is.
Today, an American saying, I'm going to cuss him out, sounds like informal, maybe slightly uneducated American slang. But it is actually an ancient 17th century British fast speech shortcut.
Yes.
We are speaking 17th century London slang.
We are preserving a very specific moment in linguistic history.
Yeah.
But the narrative actually gets more complicated when we look at specific regions within the United States.
Wait, I'm finding a flaw in this geographic isolation
What's the
theory.
narrative?
If America missed this massive wave of R dropping because of the Atlantic Ocean, why do people in very specific American regions drop their R's? I'm thinking of New York, Boston, or parts of the American South.
Ah, right.
The classic New York or Pak the Ka and Harvard Yard. If they were isolated too, did they just invent the exact same accent by coincidence?
They definitely didn't invent it independently. To understand this, we have to look at the social dynamics of those specific places. New York, Boston, Charleston, these weren't just random American settlements.
They were massive port cities.
Exactly. Thriving port cities. They served as the cultural and economic lifelines to London.
So they weren't truly isolated at all. The elite class in those coastal cities, I mean the wealthy merchants, the politicians, they were doing constant active business with England.
And those elites were keenly aware of London trends. Human nature drives us to emulate power and prestige.
Sure.
When that widespread R-dropping trend finally solidified in London, the American elites in these port cities took notice. They wanted to sound fashionable. They wanted everyone to know they were wealthy enough to maintain close ties with the cultural capital of the world.
It was basically the 18th century equivalent of buying a wildly expensive designer handbag just because you saw a celebrity carrying it in London.
That is a perfect way to put it.
You just artificially import the dropped R to show off your status to all the other locals. Look at me, I sound like a Londoner.
Right. And this raises an important question about how we assign value to language. Because the ultimate paradox of this entire story is how the grammar authorities of the time reacted to the dropped R.
Yes. I'm looking at the source article right now, and it points out that the grammarians and elocutionists, basically the self-appointed grammar police of the 17th and 18th centuries,
Oh, we were ruthless.
they didn't think this new pronunciation was fancy at all. They absolutely despised R dropping.
Completely.
They viewed these reductions as vulgar, lazy, and associated them with the lowest classes of society.
Phonetically speaking, there is nothing inherently elegant about dropping an R. It is simply the deletion of a consonant. To the linguistic purists of the era, it sounded like a degradation of the English language.
They thought it was ruining the
They
language.
were horrified that people were mangling perfectly good words.
That is endlessly funny to me. The grammar police originally hated the posh British accent. We see this exact same panic today.
We really do.
People constantly lament modern pronunciation shortcuts. You'll hear someone complaining that kids today drop the T in words like plenty, making it sound like plenty, or internet becoming internet.
Yes, the exact same thing.
We treat these fast speech shortcuts like they signal the absolute downfall of civilization and intellect. But hundreds of years ago, the British were doing the exact same lazy, fast speech, and the grammar cops of their day were screaming about how vulgar it was.
The parallels are striking.
Yeah,
And it proves that the sound itself isn't what matters. What matters is the social status of the person making the sound.
right.
Over time, because the trend of dropping the R was adopted by the upper crust of London society, the aristocrats, the wealthy merchants, the trendsetters.
The influencers of the day.
Exactly. Because they used it, the stigma slowly vanished. By the 19th century, this supposedly vulgar R-less pronunciation officially shook off its bad reputation. It became the undisputed new model of prestige and better speaking.
Just because the rich people were doing it. The vulgar shortcut became the proper standard purely through social climbing.
Purely social climbing.
Okay, so the American elites in Boston and New York jump on this bandwagon to sound posh. But if culture usually trickles down, why didn't the farmers in the Midwest or the pioneers heading west copy them? Why didn't the whole country eventually drop the R?
It all comes back to the timing and patterns of migration. The vast majority of the migration out of those coastal ports and into the American interior happened before that 19th century prestige shift really cemented itself.
Okay, so the timeline didn't line up.
Right. The people moving inland were firmly rhetoric. They were R pronouncers.
So they took the older hard R with them before the new trend could fully catch them.
As they moved west, they established their own communities, far removed from the influence of London or even Boston. That hard R pronunciation was passed down generation after generation, turning the bulk of the American landmass into an R-pronouncing stronghold.
Which eventually flips the script entirely. As America forged its own distinct cultural identity, sounding like a British aristocrat wasn't exactly a priority anymore.
Not at all.
Today, Americans are far more likely to mock a dropped R as sounding snobby or pretentious. Meanwhile, the Brits mock the hard American R as sounding uncouth and unrefined. We turn the exact thing we used to copy into a punchline.
We did. And to see this timeline effect play out on a global scale, we only need to look at other regions colonized by the British. Consider Australia or New Zealand.
I was just thinking about that. They sound much more like the modern Brits. An Australian accent is famously non-erotic. They drop their Rs.
Which perfectly illustrates the concept of a linguistic time capsule. Australia and New Zealand were settled by British English speakers much later than North America.
Right.
They were primarily settled in the late 18th and 19th centuries. By that point, non-rhotic, R-dropping speech had already won the battle. It was the dominant, socially influential norm across Britain.
It's like tree rings. You can literally date when a colony was founded based on whether or not they pronounced the letter R.
I love that analogy.
North America was a 17th century time capsule, so we kept the R. Australia was a 19th century time capsule, so they dropped it. That is brilliant.
It is a beautiful way to track human movement. But we also have to acknowledge that it wasn't just passive isolation that separated American and British English. There was a very deliberate, conscious effort by Americans to separate themselves.
The political rebellion piece.
Yes.
By the time the American Revolution kicks off, the colonists aren't just passively holding on to an old accent. They actively want to preserve a pronunciation that sets them apart from the people they are fighting.
Linguistic independence became a potent symbol of political independence. The colonists were fighting a bloody war to sever ties with the British Crown. In that environment, sounding like the British Crown was a liability.
Right, you don't want to sound like the enemy.
Exactly. Preserving their distinct, older pronunciation became a rallying point of national pride.
So what does this all mean? It means that keeping the hard R was essentially a phonetic act of defiance. It was a giant middle finger to King George.
Yeah, pretty much.
The colonists were basically saying, we're not going to pay your taxes, and we're definitely not going to drop our consonants just because it's trendy in London.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it beautifully summarizes the core lesson of Valerie Fridland's research. Sound change is an entirely natural physical process. Lips and tongues will always find easier ways to navigate syllables.
Sure, we want to take the easy path.
But the specific changes that actually survive, spread, and become the standard, those are dictated heavily by human social histories.
And the source mentions they carried this rebellion into the written word, too. Americans deliberately invented new spellings just to enforce that separation.
Oh, absolutely. Noah Webster was huge on this.
We stripped the U out of words like color to make it color. We changed the Y in tire to make it tire. It was a complete top-to-bottom rebrand of the language to declare independence.
Language is never just about the mechanical transfer of information. It is always, fundamentally, about identity. It signals who we are, who we aspire to be, and crucially, who we are trying to distance ourselves from.
I love that. Language is identity. And looking at it this way really forces you to reevaluate the words coming out of your own mouth. Because the way you speak isn't just about some random regional quirk you picked up growing up. Your accent is a living, breathing time capsule.
It really is.
When you speak, you are physically carrying around 16th century migration patterns, 18th century class struggles, and historical revolutions right there in your jaw.
It gives an incredible weight to everyday conversation, doesn't it? The words you use to order a coffee or chat with a neighbor are carrying centuries of human social history. You are participating in a historical continuum every time you open your mouth.
I want you, the listener, to think about your own vocabulary today. As you're talking to your friends or firing off an email, which words or pronunciations do you use daily that might secretly be ancient rebellions?
Or maybe they're just historical fast speech shortcuts.
Like cuss or bust that somehow survived a transatlantic voyage and lodged themselves in your brain.
It's a fascinating lens to view our own daily interactions through.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over. We've just spent all this time talking about how geographic isolation, literally having oceans between continents, and fierce political rebellion are what created these distinct accents in the first place.
Right.
What happens to our accents now?
That is the ultimate question for the future of linguistics.
Because in our modern era, the internet, social media, and global streaming have essentially erased geographic isolation. We hear each other constantly, instantly across the globe. You can watch a British YouTuber, an Australian streamer, and an American podcaster all in the same hour.
True.
So, are we watching the slow death of distinct accents? Will the American and British ways of speaking eventually merge back together into one standardized internet dialect?
It's definitely possible.
Or, because human beings always need a way to show who belongs to what group, will we find entirely new, perhaps more subtle ways to socially divide ourselves through language? The next time you hear a beautifully crisp, proper British accent on television and think to yourself, wow, that sounds so historical, just remember, the true historical artifact might just be the way you're talking back to the screen.